In this first video in the field, I'm going to show you how I set up my camera for a basic shoot. Now you're going to have to excuse the sound, we've got a lot of seagulls over here and we don't have the most beautiful lighting. But nevertheless, I can still show you how I go about setting up my camera and which settings I use on a general basis. Now to begin with, I set up my camera really sturdily. It's nice and strong, so if any wind comes in, it's not going to be knocked about. And often I hang my bag on this hook down here on my central column, which we talked about in the gear video, looking at what photography gear I have. When I've done that, I always compose my image through live view. And I do that because I manually focus through live view and I can adjust my white balance through live view too. Now, there are a couple of settings that I always use when I'm shooting, and one of them is my white balance setting. I always shoot in K mode, which stands for Kelvin mode. And I do that by clicking the WB button on the top, and I have the scroller, which I can scroll left and right to either add more warm temperature to my scene or create a colder temperature. So for example, if I go down to 4350, this is what the image looks like that we're looking at. And you can see it's extremely cold, but if I scroll all the way along to, let's say, 9000, you can see we've added some warmth to the scene. So that's one setting I always use. Another setting that I always use is matrix metering, and I basically let the camera look at the light in the scene and calculate the exposure for me, rather than using spot metering or any other type of metering that your camera might offer. Now, when it comes to shooting, I always manually focus. So I do that by going into live view, pressing the magnify button and just magnifying into an area in the scene. So for example, let's say I'm going to magnify somewhere halfway down this pier here. And then when I've zoomed in, I just change my focus ring until that area comes into focus. And I do that with literally every shot. I never rely on autofocus, because while that's quite good with lots of light, in scenes where there's slightly lower light, the camera isn't very consistent, or the lens isn't very consistent in creating really sharp images. So in terms of actually shooting, once I've got my tripod sturdy and my camera ready, I look for a good composition. So I look for an interesting background subject, and then I look for a really important foreground subject just to complement the scene. Now I don't think we have a very good foreground here. We have a great leading line up here, but again, we don't have particularly beautiful light, so it's not really going to be a dramatic scene. Nevertheless, I always spend more time looking for an interesting foreground than I do an interesting background subject. So that's something to keep in mind. Now, when I've done that and I've set my composition, I always use roughly the same settings within a small range of difference. So I always use aperture of f8, ISO of 100, and I'm shooting in aperture priority, so I let the camera work out the shutter speed for me. Now the reason why I'm shooting f8 is because this lens, or both of my lenses, the 14-24 Nikon and the 24-70 Nikon lens, they both have a really wide range of apertures which we can shoot and still come out with a sharp image. So usually between f5.6 going up to beyond f11, maybe even up to f16. But f8 seems to be the sweet spot for both of my lenses. Now yours might be different, so you should do some research online or experiment yourself and see if you can find what the sharpest setting is. Now, in terms of ISO, obviously the lower the ISO, the better. So I try to keep it to 100. I'm happy to go up to around about 800, sometimes a little bit higher if there's really low light, but most of the time 800 is my maximum. And you'll see a panorama shot that we're going to process at the very end of the course in landscape, which is shot at 800 ISO on the Nikon D800. And you can see the image is a little bit soft because of that increased ISO. So I do try to keep it as low as possible. And then of course the camera works out the shutter speed, as I already said. So those settings, those are my main settings. That's what I basically start from in every shot. And then if there's extremely low light, I'll bring the aperture down to a lower number. So I'll go for a smaller aperture like f5.6 or 2.8, whatever's needed in the scene. Or if I want a larger depth of field, I'll go for something like an f16 or even higher. Or if I'm shooting a sun spike, I'll go for a smaller aperture or a higher f-stop like f22. So it really depends on the scene how I adjust my settings. This is a fairly basic scene, so I don't need to change anything really. Once I've done that, so I've focused, composed my shot, I've set the white balance, I've got the right settings, then I always take a test shot. So I'll take one test shot, and in fact I'll use my remote control. And with this test shot, I'll know if my exposure is too bright or too dark, and I can adjust it using the exposure compensation button. Now, if it's a scene with a high dynamic range of light, of course, I'm going to start bracketing. So I'll choose my bracket button and I'll just scroll along. And we're going to look more at bracketing later on in the video series, so you don't need to worry about that right now. And then I'll bracket. When I've finished bracketing, I'll look at my darkest exposure to see if I've got the highlights nicely exposed for, and I'll look at my brightest exposure to see if I've got my shadows exposed for. And if that worked well, then the shoot should be successful. Now I should point out, when I'm shooting, I don't simply choose one composition usually. Here we're kind of limited to one composition or a couple of compositions that are fairly similar. But if I'm shooting a landscape where I've got varied foregrounds and things like that, I'll arrive quite early and I'll look for different compositions, usually 3 or 4, and then I'll wait for the light to fall beneficially. And as the light falls, I'll go from composition to composition. So I'll very slowly make sure I get the main shot that I'm looking for, and that's the most important thing. And then with my backup compositions, I'll move to them, and then eventually, hopefully I'll come out with a nice image, but you never know. So that's my basic setup. It's probably not too different to yours, but as the course goes on, I'm going to talk more about setting up in certain scenes like Milky Way shots, long exposures, shooting sun spikes and things like that. But this is just to give you an idea of how I work from a very basic scene and how I set up my camera.